How many of you guys know what this is? I bet you I'd have to explain it to anybody below 40. This is how we used to get our news back in the dark ages. And I'm telling on myself, but I read this crazy thing every single day except Sunday. I never get there on Sunday. But I start my day off, actually, it's about the fifth or sixth thing I do of the day. But when I finally get to Famous A's, I go there for this stupid thing and a cup of coffee. And I think it was yesterday. There was an article. I'm not going to mention the denomination, but it was right on the front page. I'm sure you're all just on the edge of your seats, ready to read something about some denomination somewhere, something only a preacher would read. But one of our denominations had this big vote. I knew it was coming. I had a couple of friends in this denomination that told me that this was a critical time for them. And worldwide, every member, every conference of this denomination voted on same-sex marriage and LGBT ordained clergy. And they voted not to do same-sex marriage. This is not why I'm illustrating it, but or the clergy thing as a worldwide denomination. But there are the American conference was vastly for it. And so they were devastated. In fact, they used the word devastated. There's other conferences, Africa, and believe it or not, Russia, carried the day and kept this particular denomination on the more, what I would say is the more biblical track. And the American part of this denomination was just ticked, absolutely ticked. And there was two paragraphs that just really stood out for me. The first one, in the weeks since that vote, several small but powerful cadres of pastors and bishops have begun plotting paths to overturn or undermine the decision or the vote. And I read that and I said, I think I read that somewhere before. This sounds familiar. And isn't it convicting when the church starts sounding like the world? Just a thought. Here's the paragraph that really got me. In conference calls and clandestine, that means under the radar screen, meetings, the desperate groups are discussing options that include splitting the denomination or the church into two denominations, and this is the classic, and withholding funds until the pressure prompts the denomination to redo the recent vote at the next worldwide meeting in May of 2020. When I read that, I thought, these are pastors and what this particular denomination calls bishops. They're voting, the American thing is voting to withhold their money because they're not the biggest conference, but they're obviously the richest conference. So they didn't get their way, so they're going to withhold the money to make all the other conferences do what they want. I wonder how many of those pastors and how many of those bishops have gotten ticked through the years in their churches when laymen didn't like what they were trying to do and withhold their tithe, and they get all ticked about it. Now they're doing the same thing. You say, Pastor John, why are you talking about this denomination? All for this purpose. Even churches with a capital C, even the church is struggling with what it means to be a Christ follower. Even pastors, even bishops, even general superintendents struggle from time to time with what it means to pick up your cross. Doesn't it sound like Christ? I'm going to withhold my money and I'm going to put financial pressure on you until you do it my way. Doesn't that sound like Jesus? We all struggle with what it means to be a Christ follower. In Mark chapter 10, we're methodically moving down. I'm going to wrap this up next week and then put the icing on the cake on this series on Easter. I'm going to back it up to verse 33. It says, we are going up to Jerusalem. Jesus says this to his disciples, trying to help them to appreciate what's about to happen to him and ultimately what's going to happen to them. And he said, the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. Now here comes verse 34. We were in this verse last week. Who will mock him, spit on him, flog him. That was last week. Now listen to this. And what? Kill him. And 3 days later, what? Rise again. God grades on the cross, not on the curve. What does it mean to follow Jesus? Write this down. Following Christ can lead to being terminally vanquished. Following Christ can lead to being terminally vanquished. They killed him. And obviously, like we were teaching last week and throughout this entire series, whatever happens to the guy we're following can what? Can happen to us. Can I ask you a question? What should be a Christian's attitude toward death? All the old folks are saying that, and all the young folks are going, I don't know about that. I thought I gathered a couple of things of how children, the young ones, see death. Gilda, if I've said that right, Gilda, Gilda, age 8, said, when you die, they put you in a box and bury you in a hole because you don't look too good. Gilda's got a good handle on it. Stephanie, age 9, doctors help you so that you will not die until you pay their bill. Oh, there's a gal that has a handle on it. Raymond, age 10, said, a good doctor can help you so you won't die, and a bad doctor sends you to heaven. Marcia had the best, in my opinion, 9 years old. When you die, you don't have to do homework in heaven unless your teacher is there too. Then you got to do your homework. What should be a Christ follower's attitude towards death? I do believe we live in a sin-sick world, and we lose loved ones. We're about to lose a member of our family, and my wife's brother is near death. And many of you have experienced it. Our family has experienced it. And certainly it's human, it's even spiritual and Christ-like to mourn, especially that first year. The first birthday, the first anniversary, first Christmas, first New Year's Eve, first Valentine's, first Mother's Day, first Father's Day, just goes on and on. And it's almost like every special day kind of drives the knife a little deeper. And that's normal, and it's even healthy to cry and to weep. It's even scriptural. But it's also scriptural to reach a point where it's time to accept God's healing, want God's healing, and move on. That's Scripture. Time to mourn, and a time to grieve, and a time to move on. Many times, I've seen Christians struggle with their ability to move on. In fact, I've even tried to minister to some that really are never the same again. It's like there's this cloud, there's this depression, they just don't move on. And sometimes I'm not sure they want to move on. And we've talked about that. We've talked about some of the reasons. And they're very, they're kind of in your face, almost hesitate to say it sometimes. And sometimes I grapple with these things. But, when you're hurting, the one thing you can say about when you're hurting, you're the center of attention. If you're not hurting, will they forget me? If I'm healthy, that means I got some responsibility. I got to be the minister. I think I'll just stay hurting. Or to get over someone is somehow to be disloyal to him. To her. To get over someone's loss means, man, I must not have loved them. Or to try to hold on, they don't want to let go. The only thing they have left is their pain. And so if they let go of their pain, they're let going of them. And you get to the point, we've talked about this many times, you get to the point as a believer, as a Christ follower, you want your pain more than you want your master's healing. That's a problem. You can't be a Christ follower and want something more than your master's healing for you. Tony Campolo, back in his day, I think he's in heaven now, tremendous writer, tremendous communicator, and he was out in Oregon. He was speaking in a church there, and they had this invitation, and they always would have great responses, and they had this healing time and prayer for healing. And this fellow comes up, he's 58 years old, he's in the last stages of cancer, comes up with his wife, and they pray over him, and God really shows up, and it's a powerful, powerful service. And afterwards, Tony goes back. He lived outside of Philly, and so, all the way across the other side of the country. 3 days after that service, phone rings, and it's this guy's wife. And I'm not sure, but let's say her name's Mary. And calls up and asks for Tony, and Tony's wife said, "It's Mary, and the lady that you prayed for her husband." And so he gets on the phone. She says, "Tony, I'm Mary. I'm the guy you prayed for my husband. He had cancer." And Tony got all excited, and he said, Had? And she says, "Tony, my husband died today." And all the air went out of the room. You get all excited, and then, like a balloon that gets a leak. And all the air just comes out. And he says, "I'm so sorry." And she says, "Don't be." He said, "When my husband came to that service that morning, he was a bitter, angry man. He knew he was going to die. He wasn't going to see his grandchildren grow up. And he was miserable to be around. He would lay around in bed, blame God, curse God. But when he left that service, he had a peace he had never experienced. He had a joy he never experienced." And I can tell you the last 3 days, we did more singing, more laughing, more praying, more reading Scripture, more talking to each other than we did in a whole lifetime. It was wonderful. And then she said something that was very profound. She said to Tony, "Jim wasn't cured of his cancer, but he was healed from it." He wasn't cured in terms of the temporal cancer being removed. And even, we've all experienced those healings. In our church, we've experienced wonderful healings. In my own family, I've shared with you how we almost lost Lish and in childbirth, their firstborn son. And we've all had those times. But every one of those scenarios, it's temporal. Everybody's going to die. I hate to break that to you, but the death rate's hovering right around 100%. When Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, he got to pay taxes for a few more years, and then he died again. Poor guy had to go through it twice. But somebody who's healed in his soul, in his spirit, that's eternity right there. Are you with me this morning? Love what a Black Baptist preacher said to a brother who was kind of struggling in his I don't know if he just lost somebody or he just got some bad news, but he had a really great perspective on the whole thing. He said, brother, when you kick the bucket, we're going to carry you out, put you in the ground in the back church yard. We're going to throw dirt in your face, and then we're going to go back in and eat potato salad. So get a life. You know what I mean? Just deal with it, and move on. If you're going to be a Christ follower, you got to have a right attitude about death. Number 2, write this down. The second thing we learned from this very brief phrase, and killed him, 3 days later, he rose again. Following Christ can lead to being temporarily vanished. Temporarily vanished. It said 3 days Jesus vanished. He was in the grave. He was in the grip of death. He was in a place where he didn't want to be, had to go there. For you and me, he went there. Let's talk about a guy who didn't belong where he was. But he went there for you and me for 3 days. You know what that says to me? If you're going to follow that guy, every now and then you're going to have to be in a place you don't want to be. Every now and then you're going to be in a place you feel like you don't belong here. It's like what we talked about 2 weeks ago, that holding pattern where you're just spinning around some airport because you can't land, you can't escape, you can't get out of it, you're trapped. What's a Christ follower's attitude towards holding patterns? What's a Christ follower's attitude about being someplace you don't want to be? Some of you are there right now. You're in some circumstance, doesn't feel right, shouldn't be here. How did I get to this place? How do I get out of it? Maybe the proper attitude is, what do I need to accomplish while I'm in it? The old adage, bloom where you're planted. Maxwell used to say, wherever you are, there you are. The definition of concentration, wherever you are, be there. Or in Scripture, whatever your hands find to do, do it. Bloom where you're planted. Even if you don't like where you are. You know, I've shared with you, I love history, and especially the World War II era. That was my dad's era, so I read a lot about it. And I've shared with you the second highest, most dangerous job in World War II was flying those B-17s over Europe. The only more dangerous thing was being a Sherman tank driver across France. And there was this B-17, they're trying to come make it home. They could take unbelievable damage. These planes could just take all kinds of hits and still make it home. And they've taken all kinds of bullets and they're vibrating. They barely make it over the cliffs of Dover, and they finally land, and the crew jumps out before the thing explodes. Well, it doesn't explode. And the crew comes in, the maintenance crew, and they start trying to figure out all the damage. And they find 11 20-millimeter shells in the fuselage where the gas is. 11. That thing should have exploded in midair. And so they cautiously begin to look a little closer. You know what they find? 11 shells that are empty. No explosives inside. And in the 11th shell, they find a note from an underground Czech freedom fighter who's been in a German prison camp and in a German munitions factory. And every now and then, they can't do every shell or they'll get caught, but every now and then they'll assemble the shells and fail to put the explosives in. Now that boy doesn't even know what he did. When he saved an entire B-17 crew, that's about 8 or 9 guys. They have no idea what they did. They're just being faithful where they've been planted. Are you with me this morning? Where have you been planted? And what does it mean to be a Christian in that place? That's the question. That's the question. It's not so much, how soon can I get out of this thing? The question is, what does it mean to be a Christian, and what should I accomplish in that place? That's the question. And what does God want to accomplish in me in that place? Sometimes to get to the truth, it's a matter of asking the right questions, not just getting the right answer. Boy, that was for somebody, because that last 5 minutes wasn't even in my notes. I wonder who that was for. You're out there somewhere. I was reading of a Frederick, what was his last name? I have it written down. His name was Frederick Green. He's 82 years old. He lived in San Leandro, California. I'm not sure where that's at. And all of a sudden, he just disappeared. Nobody ever saw him for 2 weeks. For 2 weeks, his mail's piling up in front of his door. And one of his neighbors across the hall starts getting nervous and can't get an answer at the door. So they call the cops. The cops come, they break in the door. And there's Frederick laying on the floor of his bedroom. He's been there 2 weeks. There's odor. There's the smell of decay. He's cold as ice, hard as a brick. So, they call the coroner. Some of you remember this. And so the coroner comes in, and they're looking around, making sure there's no foul play. And the coroner takes this picture. I don't know if it's old-fashioned or maybe with, a TV thing, or an iPod thing with a flash. But as soon as the flash went off, there was this faint gasp. Very faint gasp. Everybody froze. And they bring the paramedics, and the paramedics jump back in, and they start doing mouth-to-mouth. They start pumping his heart. They rush him to the hospital. They give him all kinds of IVs. That guy made a full recovery. Now think about that. 2 years on, 2 years. 2 weeks on, not 2 years. 2 weeks on the floor, no food, no drink. Nobody hears from this guy. He's on his last gasp. You know what that says? It's always too soon to quit. If you're going to be a Christ follower, and you're where you don't want to be, the question isn't always, how fast can I get out of here? It's, what do I need to do while I'm here? And what does God want to do in you while you're there? Because sometimes being a Christ follower takes you to bad places, just like Jesus. Write this down. The third thing we learn from this, just this little phrase, and killed him, and 3 days later, best 3 words in the Bible, what are they? He will rise. He will rise, depending on your version. Jesus rose. The greatest all-time, undefeated, undisputed, heavyweight comeback victory in the history of the world. You ever want to refute Christianity? Go after the resurrection. Because if that didn't happen, we're done. Some of the greatest minds have gone after the resurrection for the express purpose of refuting it. I was talking with Donna earlier today, and we talked about it in our life group this last Tuesday with David and Judy. And I think, Judy, you mentioned, I wrote it down, Donna helped me with, Lee Strobel wrote The Case for Christ. He started off wanting to refute the resurrection. And then Josh McDowell, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Josh McDowell started with the purpose of refuting the resurrection. And they both got converted in their studies. And I think, Donna and I were talking about it, and we think that even C.S. Lewis started with the purpose of refuting the resurrection. He wrote Mere Christianity. Some of the best minds in the world start off with the purpose of refuting it, and their own study convinces them of its authentic event. I don't know if it's in the Screw Tape Letters. I don't know where I read it. two demons are talking to each other. They're down in hell, and they're talking about this war that's going up on earth. One turns to the other and says, you know, if these liberal theologians that are teaching our seminaries ever let Jesus out of the tomb, and if these conservative preachers, these holiness and Baptists and charismatic preachers ever start preaching it, my hell, all heaven will break loose. And that's true. It's no wonder the enemy put such an effort to refute the resurrection. Because we'd all go down if it didn't happen. Any of you guys ever attend a Black Baptist funeral? You guys? I tell you, I'm not sure you know how to follow Jesus until you've been to a Black Baptist funeral. I've done several funerals. I've even done I did a funeral and a wedding at St. Andrews. Do you know that? I sat right beside the priest. And I've been to several, all kinds of funerals. I went to one funeral. It was the basketball teammate of my daughter Stephanie. It's tragic loss. The place was packed. They had 9 preachers. 9 preachers. And they grabbed me. I was the 10th. I didn't even go to I just went to show up, and they put me on the platform. Several years ago, a guy named Clarence, a young man, passed away. Tragic loss. Man, his pastor preached and brought a powerful sermon. And after he was done, he wasn't done. After he preached the sermon, described the resurrection in beautiful terms, exciting terms. But then he walked down behind the pulpit, off the platform, and the family was sitting right in the front row, and he started just talking to the family, and quoted John 14 about let not your heart be troubled. You know, you believe in God, also believe in me. In my house are many mansions. He just started talking about heaven, how wonderful heaven was. And then you know what he did? Never saw this before. He started preaching to the open casket. Now, I'll give you the willies. You know, he turns, and with all the authority he can muster, he says, Clarence! Clarence! I would not have been surprised if Clarence would have answered. And he says, you got away too soon, Clarence. You got away too soon. We had more to say. We had more to say to you, Clarence. And he starts going down this long litany of all the wonderful characteristics that Clarence had, and all the wonderful things that he had accomplished, and all the characteristics that he had in his life. And after he went through this litany, he says, there's nothing else to say, Clarence. There's nothing else to say. And when there's nothing else to say, Clarence, there's only one thing else you can say. Good night, Clarence. Good night. And then you know what this guy did? This will put the fear of God in you. He goes and grabs the lid of the casket and slams it down. Says, good night, Clarence. Boom! Everybody's sitting there just like you are right now, you know? And then he raises up, and he's got this little twinkle in his eyes and a little smirk on his face. And he says, Clarence, good night, Clarence. Good night. Because I know this morning that my God has a great get-nut morning for you. And at a moment that this guy timed perfectly, his choir jumps up and starts singing in that great get-nut morning, I will rise in that great get-nut morning. And everybody jumps up and starts singing, I will rise. And everybody's raising their hands. Hands go up, tears go down. People get excited. They start dancing, hugging, celebrating right in the face of death. Why? Why? Because Jesus made the all-time greatest, undisputed, undefeated heavyweight comeback in the history of the world. some glad morning when this life is o'er, I'll fly away to a home on God's celestial shores. I'll fly away. Come on. I'll, come on, fly away, oh glory. Come on. I'll fly away in the morning when I die. Hallelujah, by and by. I'll fly away in the shadows of this life have gone. I'll fly away like a bird that prison bars have flown. I'll fly away. Come on now, come on. I'll fly away, oh glory. I'll fly away in the morning when I die. Hallelujah, by and by. I'll fly away.